Hi, and welcome back to AppSecCon 2022. In this panel, we're going to talk about security considerations for mergers and acquisitions. We've got three great speakers knowledgeable on this topic. We've got Sujit Bamawali, who is the Vice President, Chief Information Security Officer at 7-Eleven. We've got Adrian Peters, who is the Managing Director and Chief Information Security Officer at Vista Equity Partners, and Arvind Bansal, who is the Senior Director of Cloud Security and Data Protection at AmerisourceBergen. Great topic, great leaders. Let's go ahead and check it out.
Hello, everyone. My name is Sujit Bambawale, and I'm thrilled to be here with two esteemed leaders in information security, Arvind Bansal and Adrian Peters. Today, we're going to talk about security considerations in mergers and acquisitions. Now, as you know, mergers and acquisitions are commonplace in today's world, and they're complex transactions that involve a high degree of risk identification, risk management, and risk mitigation. This is especially relevant to application security, and I'm glad that we're talking about it here today. I'm going to look over to Arvind to introduce himself, and then we'll have Adrian introduce himself.
Hi, Sujit. Thank you, and really excited to be part of this panel here today. Brief introduction, Arvind Bansal. My passion is to build and transform security strategy and security programs. I currently work for a Fortune 8 healthcare distribution firm, accountable for protecting our cloud services and resources, and also protect our customers' data. Prior to this, I worked for Verizon, Experian, Willis Towers Watson, and have spent about a decade at Citigroup. M&As. So with that, I'll hand it off to Adrian.
Thanks, Arvind and Sujit. Thanks for hosting us. Pleasure to be here and great to be next to esteemed colleague Arvind as well. So name's Adrian Peters. I'm currently the CISO for Vista Equity Partners. So we're one of the 10 largest private equity firms out there, predominantly only investing in technology firms. And so M&A is very apropos to how we think about risk, especially given its technology. And so it really hits home around how do we think about the risk exposure around investments in the technology space. So again, great to meet everybody, and thanks for having me.
We all know that acquisitions, and most importantly, acquirers, as well as the acquiring party, they both need to balance the risk involved, to understand the risk involved, and to mitigate the risk involved after a lot of analysis. So let's look at the first big broad stroke here. Why are security considerations so critical for reducing the overall business risk in M&A? Adrian, I'll go to you first.
Great. Yeah, it's a great question. I'm sure Arvind's going to have some great feedback on it as well. But I'd say, first and foremost, we've seen a significant change in the landscape, just around how we think about risk. Today, for most organizations, no matter what industry you're in, cyber is probably one of your top 4 or 5 business risks today, given that most organizations are so fundamentally dependent on technology. And so I think it inherently has driven the notion around, well, what is the cyber risk picture associated with our investments, not just the financial risks, not just our compliance risks. And so I think that's fundamentally what's driving the shift in that. And it, combine that with the notion where we've now seen serious effects coming out of organizations who've gone through an M&A process without doing quality due diligence around maybe prior data breaches, where now they're taking class action lawsuits, et cetera. And so I think there's a continuous growing awareness around cyber risks at the board. And then that is now being exacerbated by class action lawsuits and the inheritance of these new risks through that process at the M&A.
Great points, Adrian. I'll just add a couple of real life examples from the career. Having been part of Verizon, I think we set the example for the industry when we acquired Yahoo. How security risk considerations significantly dropped the price of the acquisition itself. And that's sort of a great example in highlighting the kind of risk that every M&A brings to an existing established business organization. The another example I'll give you is, back in Willis Towers Watson day, we have an M&A with Willis and between Towers Watson. And Towers Watson was part of another M&A before. So you can imagine the complexity of not just the business risk, how we are positioning ourselves into the market, but also the layer of people on top of that. How are you bringing the cultures together? And culture has a direct impact on the security. Traditionally, we talk about infrastructure, we talk about technology solutions to secure the organization, we talk about awareness pieces, but no one ever talks about the culture. And it plays a huge role in the M&A world. Another example, in my current organization, we just acquired another business worth $20 billion in annual revenue. And it's spread across 13 different countries in Europe. So right then and there, you have a geopolitical consideration as well that adds to the risk of security and to the cyber going beyond the business and people part. So I would just add, a couple of those examples and colors to really think why M&As are so critical from cyber risk perspective.
Arvind, I think that's so interesting you bring that up, because I think given the current Russia-Ukraine situation, if anybody's in the past not spent a lot of time thinking about geopolitical risk and implications to M&A and acquisitions, it's more real now than it's been for a long time. So, great example.
Arvind, because you've seen some recent activity, and Adrian, I'll come to you next about this. Are there any broad non-negotiables you have in information security for information security when it comes to M&A? Just non-negotiables, you must have it, and you recommend that everyone consider that.
So I see Adrian nodding his head. So he definitely has some good nuggets there. There are a couple of things that we should always look at, that we recommend businesses should always consider when making that deal is, always starting with how the revenue is going to come to the organization and how it's going to help and support the business. And I believe cyber teams should be part of those discussions. That helps them understand, especially in today's world when digital transformation, digital revenues are so critical and many businesses are moving in that direction. If appropriate cyber considerations are not made, that's going to have an impact directly on the bottom line. So, the first part I would say is always engage security right at the beginning of the revenue generation discussions. The second part, if we look at the technology side, our goal is really to support the revenue parts of the business, right? So we want to walk into the conversation that, hey, we see this risk, but how do we manage this risk around? How do we make this happen? So that's the second lever I would pull in thinking about M&As and supporting the M&As from the cyber level perspective. The layer where it becomes non-negotiable, it really comes down to the historical aspect of the company we are acquiring, and also the level of maturity where company can go to us. So, in generally, if you have a mature program, you can always walk into another company and point out, hey, these are the 100 things that are not right. And these are the 10 things we don't want to negotiate with. But eventually we have to put that lens of business that, hey, the goal is really acting at the revenue level. So how do we look at it from a different lens? And the super non-negotiable part, I would say, if the company has a historical precedence of multiple breaches and not showing the resilience or ability to learn from it and improving, that's something would tremendously bother me. Um, and I would think probably multiple times before saying yes, it makes sense from cyber perspective. And there are good examples there, in the industry where those things continue to happen if once the business has been breached. Adrian, over to you, buddy.
No, that's. I think you hit it right there, Arvind. So I'd say at the highest level, really the way I've always addressed it is the notion around, well, what's the risk appetite of the organization, right? So what are we willing to what are the risks that we're willing to take on? And so those, the M&A process has gotten so accelerated today where you don't necessarily have the opportunity to go and assess all the risks through that M&A process. You may have the opportunity post the M&A, but during the initial bid process, et cetera, you usually don't get the opportunity to really get under the hood and look for everything. You can't go and do a full assessment. And so really what I always try and do during that initial M&A process to try and understand what is the inherent risk of the organization you're going into. And then are those inherent risks putting us outside of our risk appetite? Classic examples. Is this organization generally within a vertical that is a nation state target, right? Is that the kind of situation we want to be in or not? Does it put us at specific political or geopolitical risks that sits outside of our appetite that we want to operate in? And so I think, taking a step back is always important, which is you need to understand, like, what is our risk appetite for M&A around how we want to manage our business, the verticals we want to be in, et cetera. And then from there, making sure that the first part of the deal breakers is around making sure we navigate anything that has an inherent risk that puts us outside of that appetite. And then from there, I think it's a lot easier. From there, you can then go and do the assessments around, okay, generally, does it seem we've got mitigants in place to address the rest of those things? Because the rest of it is usually reasonably manageable versus things that inherently put you outside of your risk appetite. And so a classic example is, I'd say 3 years ago, the likelihood of you going through an M&A process with an organization that's had a major breach was reasonably small. I think today it's exactly the opposite. The opportunity if you go into an acquisition of an organization that's not had a material breach is reasonably low. And so then the question is, like, is that a deal breaker? Usually isn't. But to Arvind's point, the question is, where are they? What have they done about it? By the way, like class action lawsuits or potential class action lawsuits or data breach exposures and notifications that we basically need to start thinking about and incorporate into that M&A process and due diligence costing structure to assess whether the deal still really makes sense or not. So it's become really complicated. And security, I think, has become really intricate to helping the deal teams and management think about how should we think about the investment, and then where do we draw the line around risk appetite and deal breakers.
Yeah. Adrian. Go ahead.
I love the inherent risk part, Adrian. That's super critical, and especially the additional part on the legal implications of acquiring somebody. So thanks for sharing that. Great points. Yeah.
Let's double click a little bit and let's look at application security. Let's look at what to look for when performing a real security review on an M&A event. I'm going to look towards both of you. Adrian, I'll start with you. To really dissect things like third and fourth party relationships, open source usage, vulnerability treatment. If you have, as Arvind said, a mature security posture within your organization, but your acquisition target may not have the same, how's the calibration in terms of vulnerability treatment? And of course, there's focus on application security and things like developer buy-in and whatnot. Adrian?
Yeah, it's a great question, Sujit. And I think you kind of bring up an interesting point. Generally, if you think about security, your risk is almost always directly correlated to the amount of assets you have and the exposures of those. And I think of M&A really no different. You're going to go through an M&A process, whatever the size of that organization is, that is exactly how large your risk exposure is going to grow. And so you inherently need to go into the conversation knowing that your risk is going up. And then the question is where, how much, and what are you doing about it? Right. And so the process we generally follow, that I've followed anywhere I've worked in the past, is first of all to go through and get a reasonable understanding, again, around, I think, the inherent risks, but then also where are they on the field, right? And so dig into a set of things. First of all, I generally like to just get a sense as to, do we know whether the organization has ever had any historical breaches, right? And there are many methods to go through that, because sometimes organizations may not know themselves, especially if they're less mature, which is very common in an M&A process, that you go and acquire an organization that is less mature. And so I think that's the first key, is get a general sense as to what do they know or not know. And so we certainly have a set of practices that we apply, both doing dark web and OpenTel resource, but also doing some assessment work ourselves. Secondly, we dig into their foundational controls, which we basically have outlined as best practices, and try and get a reasonable scratch and sniff test around where are they around meeting the best practices. And then also a feel for what does the tech stack look like, because the complication does not just set in, do they have a control or not, but are the controls radically different than ours? Because at the end of the day, you want to drive for that efficiency as well. It is, we all know that when it comes to security, normalization is key to preventing security risks, not just quality controls. And so you want to figure out what is that integration process going to look like in order to make sure we normalize operations to minimize human error. And then the last component, which is really critical, you brought up, is let's not forget about about applications, right? Especially where I've always worked in organizations that really have a pretty strong technology stack. And so we certainly spend a lot of time actually even looking and doing source code reviews and code scanning to get a sense as to how good are they around the development process? How quickly are we releasing it? How can we trust the code? How do we think about open source? And I think when you start looking at code, you usually get a pretty good picture as to what does the organization's development culture look like, which inherently is indicative of security.
Yeah. So Adrian, great points there. Love the analogy and the depth that you go into there. So I would just make two broader picture points. First is, what's the ideal state, and the second is, what's the reality, right? So when the M&As are happening in the ideal state, I would love to know exactly what kind of applications they have, what's the state of their endpoint security, what kind of different assets they have, whether they have legacy assets or not, sort of get an inventory for their infrastructure, network devices, inventory for their applications, inventory for their code libraries and different tools that they're using, and whether they are open source or not, etc. Right? So that's the ideal state. You can go in, you do a perfect assessment, find out if they have threat actor, malicious things in their networks or not, and then you come back and say, hey, let's talk business, right? But in reality, speaking from my personal experience prior to my current position, what we get is, most importantly, we have a seat at the table. So you are at the seat when there are due diligences taking place. And what do we get first? We get, hey, here's the pen testing report we have. Hey, here's the assessments that we have done. Right? Hey, here's the results that we can share with you. And by the way, here's the broader level picture that we're going to give you. And we all know, generally the pen test reports wouldn't make it to you unless they've been addressed in a certain way, right? The assessment reports wouldn't make it to you unless it's more in the acceptable range. And similarly, when you get the broader view, the devil is in the detail, That's the answer, right? So in our case, very specifically, if I have to narrow it down from cyber fields to just AppSec, in the AppSec space, we were able to bring them, hey, show us your source code, show us the lines and all this stuff. And which was good. It gives a visual for what you're saying is what you're showing. But going beyond that, hey, I want to scan through your source code. I want to run through this testing and I want to go through those pieces that require certain permissions, certain access to the network, certain access to the systems. The answer was, wait. So I think I would say it's a critical component. On the positive side, we have a seat at the table. On the opportunity side, for the known reasons, people may refrain for giving us the level of access or details that we need to make a sound judgment. So a lot of us have to look at different variables and then make a judgment. So it becomes a lot of, experience and understanding based decisions versus fact based decisions.
Yeah, I think that's good, Arvind. I mean, the way I think about it is during the initial M&A process, you need to be able to synthesize a picture with little information, and you got to be very adamant about the few things you're going to push hard on, right? On our end, it was clear picture of the baseline controls, which obviously would include privileged access management. MFA is really important. Anything that basically is related to cyber insurance. And then definitely a picture around the code and the platform and trust around it, and anything around breaches. And then post M&A, when you get the opportunity to really go and dig into the detail. But you're right. I mean, it's almost an art to get a quality systematized and synthesized picture early on around, is this really red or is this green, and it's manageable.
On the subject of manageable, Adrian, you mentioned previously that these things move at a very rapid pace and that business leaders want them to be accelerated as much as possible. I'm framing this as a binary question, but I'm sure the answer is going to be, it depends. How much can we trust due diligence efforts to uncover all information security risks that we would like to be aware of?
So having been a CISO for many years, I would say I never use the word all ever because you just never know. But no, I think it's a good question. I think you need to draw a line around things that would be deal breakers in your process, and you need to refine it as the world changes. And you need to go in with the approach. I always tell my team, if we were not willing to take any risks, we probably wouldn't make any money. And I think that's probably true for any business. And so you need to go in knowing that you need to make compromises. The question is, what risks do you think you can manage and which ones can you not? And that's kind of why I pull it back to the risk appetite notion. And so for us, we believe that if organizations lack a certain set of controls, we could probably help close those. If they fundamentally don't have the culture, now you start thinking about a notion that's going to be probably a lot more significant. You may need to change management. You're certainly going to need to change the cyber team. And so similarly, if they've had historical large breaches, they didn't do quality forensics work on it, we may have potential litigation consequences. Like those to me are more like the deal breakers where I'd say we cannot accept those risks, or we may need to go and do a whole lot of additional work prior to closing the M&A. I've certainly in this role and at prior roles, we've done that where we would go in and actually go and do additional forensics work, go and do true binary analysis and full source code reviews in order to establish trust and show good due diligence. But I'd say that's probably where my head's at. I hope I answered the question.
So I think if we look at the big picture, are we the deal maker or the deal breaker in an M&A situation, right? So if you look at it, I think mostly in 80% of the M&As, we are not. the places where we have a bigger say and a higher ability to make the decision of yes or no is when the target company has a reputation, certain number of breaches, it keeps on happening, we are acquiring that, there we can substantiate, like Adrian mentioned, based on source code reviews, based on deeper scanning of the threats and what we're seeing there, and make a flip that, hey, this M&A shouldn't go through. But if we leave, and like the legal implications and the legal challenges or potential lawsuits that can happen, so in those couple of areas we have a higher degree of influence for that deal. But if I have to look very broadly, 80% of the M&As, I personally believe that the InfoSec role is crucial and critical and have to be there. But does it really rise to the level where we can say, no, don't do M&A? And I think that practically doesn't happen. That's my take.
Right. I agree with you, Arvind. I think it's probably very similar to a lot of the other due diligence that gets done, right? Which is when we start thinking about how is this organization generating revenue, right? Are they in the right TAM? What's the size of the TAM? I think in the cyber side is probably very similar in the sense that we need to translate into business language, but it's just a matter of cost, right? Hey, can we go and double the team? Do we think we can replace management and build quality security or improve the security culture? Can we go and deal with this potential litigation risk, right? And so, it's really just translating into what is the investment consequences associated with it in order for them to make better decisions.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's double click into this. We started talking about application security. We started talking about, Adrian, source code scanning. We started talking about items like that. Let's go a bit further. We have an AppSecCon going on. We'd like to give everyone listening to this a series of real tangible takeaways. So in your minds, is there an AppSec checklist pre, post, and even during M&A events that you can think of, you can recommend, you can suggest that folks listening, folks watching this will think about during their next M&A interaction? Arvind?
Yeah, I think my message is simple. Hey, just join the Purple Book community, Why? Because this question has come up, in numerous discussions that we have, the community has on a weekly basis. And I'm just blown away by the expertise and the insights that I get from those calls and discussion from the peer. And I do believe that this was raised as part of last week's discussion, that we are building that checklist. So the industry has a need for a standard guidance. We have NIST framework, ISOs, and everything else, but there has to be the second layer of what's practical and how do we help each other and across the industry vertical in those scenarios. So the short answer is absolutely yes. Purple Book community is the place to be at, and you're going to see it coming out hopefully very soon.
Yeah, Arvind couldn't have said it better.
Okay.
That is why we have this community. That's why we want everybody who's even listening to this to attend, because the more eyes we get on it, the better opinions we can generate and the better quality we can do it, because it's an evolving picture. I'd say something that's really been raising its head is obviously the change in how cyber insurance brokers are now starting to underwrite to specific controls. And so whatever checklist we were to give you today will probably be different tomorrow, because the world is changing around the expectations. But just to mention a couple, right, it's what are the languages that's being used? What's the inventory of all the code repos? Arvind mentioned it, but I can tell you, we think about Where do the breaches happen? Because we went through an M&A process and forgot to incorporate some assets, or somebody lost it, and it was unsecured out there. How many of those repos do we have? Who owns them? Consolidating those. And then again, I think you're right, which is open source code, right? Like, what are we using? How are we doing it? And who are those, right? Are we using a third party? Is it truly open source related code? Mm-hmm. And then what does our own code look like, and how are we managing that? I think the days of just doing traditional source code review or just traditional dynamic scanning is no longer the method moving forward. You have to do almost all of it. And then on top of that, we now live in a world where our infrastructure as code is in it. And by the way, everybody that we use as a third party has it as well. And so it's becoming complicated, which is why I think we've agreed at the Purple Book community that this is an initiative we need to go and take.
We talked about the importance of a checklist, and we talked about some thoughts and data points that said things are going to change, that risk is going to evolve, that the threat landscape is going to continuously evolve. But I want to continue on that speculation a bit. Obviously, none of us can predict the future very accurately. But 6 months ahead, after a acquisition closes, what do we imagine the collective risk posture to have evolved to? And I'm asking 6 months because depending on the size of the acquisitions and some of the examples that the both of you have mentioned, I don't think 6 months is enough to even reach steady state. I think 6 months, you're still kind of just outside of discovery, and you're just outside of getting your arms around what you have been given as a part of the acquisition. And you're kind of making up your mind on a few foundational items. So what does 6 months after look like to you? Adrian?
It's a great question, Sujit, and I'd hate to say it depends. So I'll try and answer it a little more accurately. I'd say, first of all, historically, the inclination has always been to slow the integration down, keep the entities as separate until we feel like we've gotten to a point where we can do the integrations in a methodical way. I think we live in a market today where that is changing very quickly. I'll give you a very classic example. Today, if you go through an M&A process, the first thing you're going to hear from is your cyber insurance broker notifies you and lets you know, by the way, you just inherited a new company who's got higher risk, fewer controls. That now applies to you. Your insurance just went up 200%. And I can tell you, like, I see this all the time. And so we've kind of pivoted this model, which is we need to accelerate the integration, the technology integration versus slow down the integration. Generally, our mandate is within 180 days, you need to have controls be at a similar level across the organizations, even if you haven't gone and done all the integrations yet. And so we try and actually calculate and incorporate those investment costs into the M&A process, because we think we got 180 days or less in order to actually show and at least make sure that the risk is equivalent versus unbalanced, at least within 180 days. And from there, you can then go through the methodical way of starting to do the integration. But that's generally the way we think about it. And naturally, that then means it's higher cost because, I always tell people, if you have people, they're already working. If there's new things that will be done, you need more. And so, I generally think it's about as like a 1.5 overhead, but you need to accelerate getting controls and risks up to par. Because to your point, Sujit, the minute you get a new organization, you inherently have bigger risks. Like, that's just the reality of it. That organization already also have some accepted risks that you may not even know about yet. And so you got to go through that accelerated process to at least make sure the baseline controls are equivalent.
Yeah. So great points, Adrian, especially about the cyber insurance. The brokers will come to you and say, hey, your risk is higher. And by the way, you have to pay multiples of this. So you're having some interesting conversation. But I can share with you, there are cases where where companies take a stand that, hey, this is the core organization. We're going to leverage the insurance here, but this is sort of non-core. So we are going to exclude that from the core coverage. So there are certain ways to look at that complicated situation differently that can result into a more favorable, relatively favorable outcome. So that's one part, and it's coming from having had those discussion and having learned about those situations from there. Now the second part uh, is it's more from reality. What I want is, or what I need is making sure 6 months from now, everything is up to the level of my organization, and we are all marching together. But in my practical experiences, having had cross-continent M&As, I think 6 months are just baby steps. They pass even before you know that they crossed in certain situations. And I'll give you an example why that happens. So when you're bringing organization across multiple places, the very first thing everybody challenges is on the network side. Hey, do I want to connect the network? And that alone, it's just imagine the number of IT teams, number of IT folks getting together and just having discussion to understand the network, and how many people coming up with, hey, you have MPLS connection here, you have 12 different locations that are using this kind of bandwidth. What's the level of traffic going through and all? So those are very intriguing discussions where you learn a lot about the network and why things cannot move very quickly. And a couple of similar situations, Active Directory. You have a large corporate organization, multiple business unit, legacy Active Directories, more than one Active Directory. I think companies have challenges in bringing ADs together, even in their own company, let alone bringing an M&A and then integrating them. The third one I'll point out is, the email part. Hey, you got a new organization. Do you operate multiple email systems? Do you combine the domains, and how do you roll that part out? That alone takes probably more than weeks and months, and in some cases it rolls into a year too. But having said that, every organization is different size and different pace. So maybe certain problem exist in the larger organization and not in not so larger organization. And the other variable is, how are you set up? So if you're set up, you're an established firm for tens of years out there, you are going to have big technology footprint. You are going to have legacy technologies. You are going to have, ideally, you were consolidated or different business units that came together to build that complexity. Now, if you are a medium or smaller or relatively newer organization, the cloud has made these things so simple and so easy compared to how it used to be. So an example would be on the email systems. If you're using O365, other companies using O365, Microsoft tremendously helps bringing those systems together and moving those, Exchange servers, mailboxes, everything happening in the cloud directly by the provider versus standing up a large team. So, in short, I would say in the large organization, the 6 months is sort of a starting point to start seeing changes on many fronts that are tied to technology. From the security side, we would ramp up 3 areas. One is the pen testing area to make sure we truly assess, how good or bad the situation is. The second part is we would truly get into, under the hood for every endpoint using different famous malware solutions that, hey, is the network relatively secure or not? And the third part is really looking at the external facing systems, external facing services, external facing apps, and making sure that we are doing due diligence around what are the OWASP top 10 there, Are we making sure those are getting addressed or not? So that would be, the pace of change in certain size of companies, depending on their footprint, the legacy, the complexity of network and system.
Thank you. That was very helpful.
Yeah.
Um, let me replay a few things you said. Previously at the start of this, you talked about culture, and now you gave some very good focused data points about networks touching each other, about the Active Directory, and about even things like should we have one email or two, and using Microsoft, and if you have Microsoft Office 365 on both sides, to use their assistants to get the two tenants together. All wonderful points, and I agree with you that 6 months may be baby steps for a large organization. So let's play that forward. What does 1 year look like? Do you think the cultures have come together at that point well enough, or do you have any litmus tests or indicators of connections or indicators of alignment that one could say, okay, it's been 8 months, it's been 9 months, it's been 1 year. I see these things showing up, which means that, we are doing better.
Yeah. So I'll make 3 quick points there, Sujit. And, the 1 year picture, the very first thing that we notice is there's a lot of anxiety in people when you're doing M&A. There's a lot of anxiety in, hey, who's going to have the job? Who's not going to have the job? Who's the acquirer? Who's the acquiree? And the 1 year time frame, takes those anxieties away for a lot of people. So in 1 year time frame, most people, where do they stand, and they're sort of mentally comfortable, and there is a better vision and steps out there to follow. So what we see 6 months versus 1 year is tremendous progress in the people front that translate into technology adoption or integration across the firms. So, for example, the decisions around emails have been made by that time. The decisions around, hey, we're going to go Azure AD and we'll have a multi-year project and get in that direction. Those kind of decisions are made. On the network integration part, hey, do we need to create a new data center, consolidate all of those places, or we need to connect to those data center and start migrating applications and all? So in 1 year time frame, those kind of decisions have been made. And the result of that is, you're bringing a lot of peace and clarity on exactly what that M&A means for people in security, for people in technology, for people in development world, and a better realization at the business level that, hey, I took the M&A keeping this picture in mind. Now I have had this baby in my home for 1 year, and I know truly how it behaves during the day, during the good day, during the bad day. So all of that has settled down in the 1 year time frame, and that brings a lot of maturity on the technology side, but that also brings a lot of clarity and need from the people perspective. So for example, a year from now, hey, we are building all these new security services that we had, but they didn't have. Now we have to stand up the team. Do I want to repeat the success that I had in my program where I'm hiring FTEs and building those capabilities? Or am I open to getting a managed service to rapidly bring that maturity up? So those kind of evaluations and discussions and agreements have happened by the 1 year mark.
Adrian, what's your sense of the 1 year milestone?
Yeah, actually, I'd say very similar to what Arvind just laid out. I think I'd say that's probably a reasonable, good North Star for how people should think about it. And say we operate pretty much the same way. I think, and so I'd say, just to add to Arvind's comment, I'd say the most important part to this is the execution oversight of this, because nothing ever turns out the way you want it to.
Yes.
Right? As you start adopting this, maybe to Arvind's comment, you learn a lot of things that you just didn't expect to, and there are a lot of adjustments you need to make to it. And so I think, given that he's given us such a good sense as to what I think a year looks like, and it's very similar to ours, I would just add the fact that you need to establish a pretty good committee group to oversee the execution of that plan monthly. It needs to be managed tightly. It needs to be clear around how we can accept those technology risks, because changes need to be made. And we're all very familiar as AppSec folks and security folks that most of the work around adjustments requires really strong coordination between the CIO, the CTO, and the rest of the technologies and engineers, that you need to adjust the plan, you need to be open to adjust the plan, and you need to have a really good partnership to drive the execution through to hit that year goal.
Adrian, you mentioned senior leadership. And I want to ask, we're leaders here as well. You have large organizations, you have oversight over these engagement, large scale engagements, and you have engagement discipline, and you have the ear of top management and whatnot. What top-down approach would you set in your org, in the large org, with regards to security in an M&A and with regards to the security outcomes of an M&A event?
I just want to make sure I get the question. Is the question like generally what's the construct by which we dictate as to what's reasonable and what's not reasonable? Got it. So I mentioned earlier that early on in the M&A process, the first thing we're trying to do is look for what is within boundary, outside of boundary of the appetite. So when we talk about reporting to investment committee or to the executive leadership, in many of the roles I've had, the first thing is, what's the current state? What is or is not outside of the risk appetite? Why do we think that is? And then what do we think the consequences associated with that is? If it's outside the risk appetite, how would we need to think about adjusting the business to accommodate for that, right? So, classic, you're going to go and invest in an organization that is a critical infrastructure, like just as an example, that now puts you in a very specific vertical. How do we think the consequences are around how we need to change maybe our culture in order to accommodate for those new risks? And then the second one is more around what's the picture of the rest of the overall program, even if the organization is within our risk appetite. And then where do those sit? And then what do we think it will take in order to get there, right? Is that just a general sense as to the cost implications associated with that? And then making sure that we give them a sense as to how we think we're going to get there. Do we think we need to pull some of our common practices that we already have in place? Is this going to be a one-off? But in order for them to at least understand, how do we think about establishing a structure for the execution of it? Because to Arvind's point, nothing ever plays out the way you want to. Sometimes they play out as another one of those, and sometimes you run into one where it's so very different. You got to deal with it in a different way.
Okay. Arvind, I'll give you the last word on this. What's your top-down management approach, and what would you set as the tone from the top for information security in M&A events?
I think there are 2 points in there. The first perspective is, as a leadership, what are the expectations of people from you, right? So the expectation is, hey, we are giving them a mission and we are giving them goals, a set of goals that are non-negotiable. And those 2 things are super critical, because when you deal with these M&A situations, there are going to be many undefined criterias, and people will be looking for that direction. People will be looking for that mission. And it helps them orient there. The second part is, there will be a lot of conflict. There will be a lot of, overstepping, a lot of assumptions across the place. So if you set a mission and if you set non-negotiable goals, those are not like 100 goals. Here's the top 3 or 4 things that are non-negotiable, and rest everybody can manage it. that's going to help the tone, um, set the tone very succinctly. And it's going to empower people at different levels to make the decision. They will have that certainty. And when people are making decisions on the ground, guess what you're doing as a leader? You have time to set the tone for the next thing. So I think that's the first part that's super critical. Setting the mission, setting the top goals that are non-negotiable, let people do the work. The second part from the tone part is, I think, over communication and being there, and be personable, be able to empathize. These are tough situations. Many people would be going through different thought process based on where they are in their life. Somebody is young who wants to travel, somebody has kids to put through school, someone has an elder parent they're taking care of. So how do you empathize with what's going on with people, when you see things are not going the way they are expected to go? So I think that's the second part, taking care of your people. So those are the two things I would focus on from the leadership side. Sujit.
Wonderful. Well,
Yeah.
thank you, Arvind and Adrian. Thank you very much. I took away a lot from this, and I certainly hope that all our viewers and listeners did as well. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful day. Thanks all.
Thank you, Adrian. Thank you, Sujit.
Thanks, Arvind. Thank you, Sujit. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you.